Okay, we come now to the last of our three little readings for today. And this is another fun little one by a guy named Rowan Williams, who the name you might recognize the name because he was once upon a time Archbishop of Canterbury. He's the guy who married Kate and William. And he's written this little book. He's also a member of the Royal Society of Literature in England. He's a published poet as well as a very, very deep thinker. And he's written this little book called Grace and Necessity. And it's about the theory of art of a guy whose name appears a couple times in this reading. His name is Jacques Maritain. And his name appears right at the top of the page on 28 and then again over on 29. And I just want to pick out a couple of things from this little reading as well that are related to the idea of ontology and a different ontology in an earlier time. So let's dig in again. Well, we might just notice we've already seen the name of Hopkins in the Boersma reading, and you might just notice that at the very top of the page on page 28 is as well. Maritain makes mention of him and his work, but I want to pick it up really after the break. So the paragraph that starts in the middle of the page on 28 and goes over to the top of the page on page 29. You'll notice that in this short reading, it's really only three little paragraphs, so we'll take them in turn. Okay, so the first point that I want to make is that in thinking about a sacramental ontology, or in thinking about how language can work, how we describe reality, that part of what gets challenged is an ordinary way of looking at the world. And that ordinary way of looking at the world is not decimated, it's not destroyed, but it's seen to be incomplete. So look at the phrase that he uses in the first sentence. The poetic process is first a kind of apprehending of the environment that blurs conventional boundaries of perception. Conventional boundaries of perception. The kind of thing that we use to get through life, our ordinary day, the things that we appeal to, remind us of our sanity and make we think that we have our feet on the ground. Right? The conventional boundaries of perception. And what poetry does is it blurs those boundaries. But then notice what he says next. Not to dissolve the actuality that is there. Okay, so when we do art, or when we do a certain kind of philosophy or theology, we are not in flight from the real world and going off into some private, totally subjective vision. The idea here is not to dissolve the actuality that is there. There is a claim here that there is an actuality that is there. And it does matter to us. It's not all about us. We aren't enclosed on ourselves. We aren't solipsistic, meaning we don't just make reality up for ourselves. There is an actuality that is there. But here's what poetry does. Here's what language can do. It can bring out, think of the Carney that we were just looking at. It can bring out relations and dimensions that ordinary rational naming and analyzing fail to represent. See the word represent, representation, mimesis, can bring out relations and dimensions that ordinary rational naming and analyzing fail to represent. Now, I think by the phrase ordinary rational naming and analyzing, that you should think of the work of science as well. Again, we're going to pursue this in the next week. We think of that as the work of rationality. We pick things apart, we figure out their inner workings, we label the elements. That's all part of ordinary rational naming and analyzing. What poetry does is something different, but it's still related to the actuality that is there. And what it does is it brings out relations and dimensions. Think of Carney's description of Aristotle on mimesis, creative redescription, hidden patterns. Notice too in the next sentence, the sense of objects, as it were, carrying with them a charge of feeling that links them to other objects. Okay, so this charge of feeling, think of Hopkins, think of the word from the Boersma reading. Think also of if there's coherence, if things are more than themselves because they participate in the divine reality, then it is altogether possible that things are related to each other because they both participate in this larger reality. And that creates connections not only with God, the God in which they participate, but connections that go horizontally between these two realities because they both share in the larger reality. So there's a sense of a musical apprehension. There's a sense in which metaphor, here's where this really helps us to understand what metaphor is. Metaphor is, we can't help ourselves but talk in metaphor, and it makes sense if things are interconnected, sharing in a larger reality. Things naturally spill their own boundaries and are thought of in terms of another reality. Metaphor is inescapable. The level at which my sense of an object and its intrinsic life are indistinguishable. So it has its own intrinsic life, but that doesn't cut it off from me. My own sense of it, my own way of describing it, my own language for it is not simply my own. It shares with that, as indeed the two share in a larger reality. The next paragraph develops this sort of language. What I want you to notice from this paragraph is particularly the importance of certain kind of language. I'm thinking of words like music, analogy, intrinsic relations, proportions, metaphor again, frequency, and it all comes together in a word that he puts in italics, as Boersma put it in italics, the word participation. Okay, let's just go through this paragraph a little bit and flesh that out. I suppose the main thing here is that it is all to do with things being more than they are. And that's a statement of something we've already seen. Things being more than they are. Notice also the emphasis on action. Something about the life of this object in action shares the same style of action as is seen in something different. So this style of action, there's something about activity that is integral to the notion of ontology in this older idiom. And so let's now move on to that word. So he introduces the idea of participation as an old and technical word. And indeed, it comes from the Middle Ages. And, well, it arguably, it was all the way back to Aristotle, as we'll see in a future reading. But it's a word that is bound up with this ancient ontology, and ontology that differs from ordinary rational naming and analyzing that has become associated, quite frankly, with science. There's one other paragraph that can give us a sense of how seriously these poets and thinkers take this possibility. I know that in the past I've thought, oh well, when the poet talks this way, he or she is just being, having creative license or talking artistically. But I've come to appreciate that there is a technical seriousness to the sort of language that they use. And the focus of this paragraph is this fantastic story about T.S. Eliot and the undergraduate student. So this undergraduate student asks T.S. Eliot what he meant by the line, "Lady, 3 white leopards sat under a juniper tree." And T.S. Eliot responds, "In all seriousness, I meant, lady, 3 white leopards sat under a juniper tree." And it's true. It's not a cover-up. He's not trying to be coy. He's not trying to be evasive. He's not being a dick. He's saying that collection of words in that order, that sequencing, it created a resonance. It created a moment that provided and provides for us access to something that was previously inaccessible or hidden. Another dimension becomes available. And so the poet helps to reveal that there are these other dimensions out there, and that perhaps the real is more than what we have been trained to think it is in modernity. That the world is not necessarily as it seems to us. Now, I don't think there's a claim here that all poets are necessarily signing up for this or would happily agree with a description of this other ontology, but it may be that they tap into it nonetheless. And what this paragraph also does is to say that obscurity or indeterminacy, ambiguity, can be natural strengths to the artist, to the poet. And that so the artist and the poet can have a natural place in thinking about serious things, about metaphysics. Because when there is this surface indeterminacy, that can maybe be a cue to us to say, well, I shouldn't have been looking for the rationally obvious anyway. I should be looking for those things which are not readily available to that ordinary way of thinking and ordering reality. Okay, that is the third and the final reading for this week. I hope that you've enjoyed them, and I hope that this process works for you. Thanks.